Well, after my last video about the prostitute and the kidnapping charge, I kept thinking more and more about the law and government abuse of the law, and it's one of those really, really important issues because it might be the most, or at least one of the most contentious issues that reservations people have about a market economy or a free society. It's one of the main uh, crutches that statism has. I mean, the other one, I think the biggest one is probably defense, and the second one is law or arbitration, although I think the two are kind of a little bit different but related. And I think the biggest condemnation that I can make against the current, I mean, theoretically, we can look at it and say, yes, if you have a monopoly on law, it's going to be abused. The people who are in charge of it have an incentive to lie. They have an incentive to take advantage of it. They don't have any real feedback as to how well they're doing. They have a knowledge problem. How can your local prosecutor in any given municipality, let's just for now ignore the federal government, how can they really understand all the laws, all the circumstances of people's interactions, and be able to come up with anything even approximating just charges against people, sift out what's right and what's not. And the same is true with judges. But I think if you just look at it empirically, and I mean, at our current society, and you can look at it anecdotally, you can also look at it, there are some statistics available about this, and if you just look at it historically, clearly the government abrogation of legal authority is meant for the private gain of the government individuals that partake in the process, whether it be the prosecutors, whether it be the magistrates, or even the president, the judges, and actually nowadays even a whole host of ancillary private individuals. For instance, if there was a serious attempt to actually legalize, say, marijuana, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the bail bondsmen of America donated a lot of money to try and prevent that from ever happening, because they basically have free cash flow because of all the people coming into federal incarceration. But the argument against it is that, well, you need a state because people can't imagine there being an objective third party. If you and I have a dispute, who are we going to turn to arbitrate that dispute? Are we going to pick a jury? How is that going to be fair? Are we going to pick some kind of arbiter or a judge? How is that going to be fair? And so let's have this objective institution that can be a third party that is impartial and that can judge the matter. And I would agree that hypothetically, if that was possible, that would make sense. But there's one obvious problem with that, and that is, what if the arbiter and the disputant are the ones who have a dispute? Then the arbiter cannot be an objective third party. And when you have a single institution, I mean, if you have a single person, say King Solomon is the highest arbiter. Well, if you have a dispute with King Solomon, then you cannot expect to receive fair justice. King Solomon might be a sagacious, judicious person, and he may actually still rule in your favor, but that is highly unlikely. You're assuming a degree of basically sainthood, a benevolence that is something that can never be guaranteed, especially electorally. But when you have a single institution, so the government general, so not in the single person of, say, a king, but the government or the judicial branch of the government, then all disagreements with the government have at least some degree of this conflict of interest. And so the idea that the government is an objective third party is a myth. The government could be an objective third party if it was not in the dispute. So it is hypothetically possible that, say, Theodore Roosevelt, when he arbitrated the dispute between, much as I hate Theodore Roosevelt, but he arbitrated the dispute between Japan and Russia during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, or the war was in 1905, I don't know if he arbitrated then. And you could make a clear argument that Roosevelt wouldn't necessarily have been biased one way or the other. But if Roosevelt and the U.S. government are prosecuting the case against somebody whose only crime is not between another American citizen but with the United States government, that wouldn't make sense. But beyond that theoretical argument, just looking at, in practice, what's going on, I think it's very clear that the judicial establishment, the government, that is the prosecutors, the judges, the lawyers, but of course that's redundant because at this point the vast majority of all judges, prosecutors are lawyers. And lawyers are like bail bondsmen in that sense that they are a protected class. They are a class that has been granted actually basically a monopoly, by the way. It is illegal to hire a non-lawyer as legal counsel. It is legal for you to defend yourself. But there are actually cases where parents attempted to argue in favor of the rights of their children, and the Bar Association would file suit against them saying a parent cannot defend their child. I mean, we're talking like there was a case in Ohio about homeschooling or a child with drug testing. The child was like 8 or 9, and the parents attempted to, because they didn't have any money, to defend the child, and the Bar Association of Ohio litigated against them, totally independent of the case that was going on for defending. I don't know actually how that turned out. They may have made an exception for children, but by and large, if someone came up to me, which I would not recommend, and said, hey, you seem like a smart guy, would you be my lawyer, would you come and sit with me, which I'm not, I don't know anything near close enough. There's a lot of libertarian books and stuff about how to do that. I have not looked at it, so I'm not the person to ask, but we would be probably gone after for that reason. But anyway, that's a tangent. If you look at what happens in the judicial system, it is very clear that it operates for the private interest, not necessarily of the government in the abstract, but for the private benefit of the constituent individuals. And we can see this really, a good book on this, by the way, is called The Pursuit of Justice. It was put out by the Independent Institute, and it takes a public choice theory, which, you know, I mean, Rothbard like goes off on them all the time, but I welcome their insights in this matter because they looked at it empirically, and you can basically demonstrate that there is systematic personal bias of the various government officials involved in the provision of justice. But if you look at our legal system, which the American one is without question based on the English one, the English legal system, as I've mentioned in comments, and I think I've said before, has its origins in English common law, which is a anarchistic, non-state law code. It's a code that developed among the various Germanic tribes that eventually settled Britain, not the Celts and the original Britons, although we don't know what kind of legal systems they had, at least I don't, although I would imagine it was probably also fairly anarchic. But if you look at the Angles, the Saxons, these were basically stateless societies when they settled Great Britain, when they migrated from Jutland and from Northern Europe. And actually later in the 9th and 10th centuries, when you had a lot of Nordic Vikings in England, a cultural phenomenon that is still evident. Actually, you can tell where the Vikings were based on the last names. A lot of Nordic last names are visible in certain counties in basically northeast England, and that's where the Vikings settled. Actually, if you know someone whose last name has the word son in it, so John's son, Jack's son, that is a Nordic naming convention. That's what they still do in Iceland, by the way. In fact, you don't have a last name. Your first name is that. But the Nordic law code, similarly, totally anarchic. The Old Norse really didn't acquire a state until, in Norway anyway, until the 800s, which is actually what encouraged the settlement of Iceland, people escaping the codification of a monarchy in Norway. But basically, English common law was developed and practiced for hundreds and hundreds of years without state interference. And the first monarchs of Great Britain did not really have a hand in this. They didn't prosecute, they didn't appoint the judges, they didn't pass legislation, they levied taxes, relatively minor taxes by today's standards. They were the feudal overlord, but they weren't institutionally taking care of justice. And this, we might argue about certain aspects of common law that we find a little weird, but basically the idea was if there's a dispute, if there's a problem between two individuals, that they should resolve that. There should be restitution paid. If there's no victim, then there is no crime. And basically they would either have a jury or there would be an arbiter who they would select, and you would... The main difference that we would see with it, that would be a problem with this system, was the standards that they had for evidence. Basically, you would get people to swear an oath. So you could say, okay, I have 10 witnesses who swear that he stole my pig. And he only has 2 witnesses that swears that it was his pig originally. You know, they didn't have fingerprints, they didn't have video cameras or pictures, obviously. There obviously weren't artists going around painting thefts and stuff as they occur, which of course is the majority. Property disputes of one form or another are the vast majority of these. The other common practice, which I think it, has a really bad name nowadays, but it's mostly because people don't understand it, is the idea of an ordeal. You know, you hear about it quite often in contemporary culture that, well, to see if you were guilty or not, they would dunk you in water, and if you floated, then that was God showing that you were innocent, and if you sank, then you weren't, or I don't remember all the details. And there are other ones, if you they burn you with an iron, and if boils developed or a blister developed, you weren't guilty. And among the Norse, they would have trial by combat. They'd say, okay, you guys can't, then you'll fight. And the idea in modern society is to condemn all this and say, look, they don't know what they're doing, this is just superstition. But really what the whole point of that was to try and incentivize the disputants to, the disputees to resolve their differences without going to arbitration. So if you and I have a dispute over, I don't know, a couple $100, and then we can't resolve it, and they say, okay, so to resolve your dispute, you're going to have a trial by combat, or we're going to burn you both with hot irons. All of a sudden, we might say, okay, wait a second, let's really talk about this. I'll give you 80% or whatever. It was an incentive to come to a resolution to the conflict without going to arbitration. That was the whole point of the ordeal. And so that made sense. If you were going to try and incentivize people to not have the arbitration to resolve it on their own, you need some kind of way to do that. And this just say, well, we're going to let God decide by putting you through some kind of basically torture, then that would do. Now, I'm not saying that's perfect, but it's misrepresented. But what eventually happened was, after the Norman conquest in 1066, some of the later Angevins, the descendants who founded that dynasty, got the bright idea that this is a potential source of revenue. So what they would do is they would appoint judges, they would appoint magistrates, they would have the sheriffs. This is what the sheriffs would have a hand in this, and they would say, okay, if 2 people have a dispute, they have to resolve it from the judge, but then instead of there being really restitution, the penalty would go to the crown. And the whole point was just to raise revenue for the king. And this is very indicative. Anybody who researches medieval history even a little bit, and I'm no expert, but I've read enough to know even a cursory looking at it, is they were always on the lookout for more money. This is before fractional reserve banking. This is before fiat money. Really, there were examples of it. Someone's going to put on here the stick and tally system, but by and large, gold and silver is what paid mercenaries. Gold and silver is what bribed other countries. Gold and silver is what you used to get what you wanted, not tally sticks. That was kind of tax loophole, really. And they were always looking on new ways to tax, and that's originally how it was. There was no pretense whatsoever that the idea was the common law system isn't functioning, there aren't enough people being convicted. It was, this is a source of revenue, a potential source of revenue. And I think later, I mean, among libertarians, the idea is, well, maybe they're just going to use it so they can abuse their own power. True, but I actually don't think that was the original impetus. I don't think that King John or Henry II, or King Henry I for that matter, was necessarily thinking, oh, this way I can, have a legal monopoly and then be above the law. Because really the kings, at least rhetorically, considered themselves to be bound by some law. They were above other people, but there were laws they had to follow. At least so they said, especially vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. The idea was just, this is potential tax revenue. And then they invented a whole new class of crimes where there was no victim, where you just you broke, quote, the king's peace. This would be like poaching a deer on one of his estates. Deer doesn't belong to anybody, but they'd say, hey, you poached a deer, you poached lumber, you committed some kind of heresy. They actually had different law codes because the Catholic Church had their own law that they were enforcing on people for heresy or whatever, or sodomy. And these are what we would call mola prohibitae. Mola in C is Latin, and it means it's evil in itself. That's like murder or theft or rape. Mola prohibitae is just like, it's not really evil, but you can't do it. And this was a whole new class of crimes, and once they started generating money from it, that became real popular. And this is what paid for the sheriffs back then, Sheriff of Nottingham. He got his money, his whole livelihood was dependent on convicting people of crimes and then exacting payment out of them, which gave him an incentive to be as much of a tyrant as possible. Now, ancient history, right? This is the system we have today, basically. Again, that book, In Pursuit of Justice, in the last story I talked about, let me step back a second. In the last story I talked about, with the guy who held a hooker up, he was charged with kidnapping, which was clearly not what he was doing at all. Maybe something else, but and kidnapping in this state carries a mandatory life sentence. And I have a couple other friends who've been arrested for other crimes. They've done where they did stupid things, but then the charge is always orders of magnitude above that. And anecdotally, everyone I know who's actually been called to court for other than traffic violations get that treatment. And it's absolutely, totally commonplace, if not completely what always happens almost, that you will be charged with a vastly greater crime than what you actually may have been doing. And the question has to be asked, if the government was really out there for justice and attempting to correct wrongs, then that makes no sense at all. If it's really about justice, then they should think about what you actually did and charge you with that. And so what the person I was with actually eventually pled guilty to, as opposed to pleading guilty to kidnapping, was reckless endangerment with a deadly weapon. Well, if that's what he really did, if that's what the government really thinks that he did, then that is what they should have charged him with. If they catch you with weed, they shouldn't just say, okay, we're going to charge you with, dealing and racketeering or whatever, if all they really want you to do is plead guilty to possession. Then they should just charge you with possession. And it has to be asked, why the waiting? Why the waiting of the charges? And the simple answer, there's no answer to this that has anything to do with an attempt, even a cursory one, to arrive at justice. The clear reason to do this is to get a conviction. Well, why would that matter? Well, because prosecutors measure their success by how many people that they get convictions. And this is an empirical fact that they will get more convictions just prior to their election. So elections are in November. There are more convictions in October than any other point of the year. And there are more wrongful convictions where we have data on people who are later acquitted or shown to be innocent, and many more of them are convicted in October than and later in the year than in other points. Especially, I mean, the best time to face a prosecutor is right after they get elected, because then they don't care. They can't go and say, look at all the people I. The point is, the prosecutors, these government agents, just like Sheriff of Nottingham, they're not taking the money directly, although they're getting paid by the state for the more people there, more time they're in court, I'm sure. They have political aspirations. Their position in almost all cases is an elected one. There are municipalities and states where this isn't true, but in most of them it is. And they want to be seen as doing. It's interesting. They're not actually doing justice, but they have to be seen as doing justice. And like the government has no real rubric to decide how well it's doing. Unlike a business who knows, hey, it's making money. You know, I just read an article today about retail outlets that are scaling down a little bit because, hey, we're not making quite as much money. We've got to close a few stores. The prosecutor, the government have no way of knowing to what degree they are fulfilling justice. It's an abstract concept, actually, and then since they're funded by taxes, there's no profit incentive, there's no volunteerism, so they invent statistics. This is what GNP and GDP basically are for. I mean, literally, the government invented those to try and find a way, perhaps a sincere, honest attempt, to understand if what it was doing was helping the economy during the Great Depression. Likewise, the only thing a prosecutor can really say is, look at all the convictions I got. Now, unless, of course, there's a really singular, high-profile one where you can say, I got the cop killer or the murderer or whatever. Absent that, all they can do is say, look at all the convictions I got. To say I delivered justice, to say I had lots of people come in here and I determined that they were innocent and I didn't charge them, that doesn't look any good. To charge people, if you charge people with lesser crimes, they're more apt to defend them. You know, like my partner was absolutely terrified that he'd get life in prison. But if he had been charged with something that was, say, a misdemeanor, or maybe he might only get a month in jail, he might have actually attempted to defend himself. But then that wouldn't have done any good for the prosecutor whatsoever. That would have been more judicious. There would have been a trial then, and we would have had a much better idea of whether he was guilty or not, or what he actually did, because there would have been evidence presented much more rigorously and with much higher standards. So if you care about justice, that's what you would want. You would want there to be a trial. And if he's innocent, then he'd be acquitted. And if you want justice, you definitely want that to happen. But if you're a government prosecutor, you need a statistic to show that you're doing a good job so you can get reelected. Obviously, they have ambitions. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Their ambition might just be to stay prosecutor. Usually, they have political aspirations to maybe be a judge, maybe run for city council. I mean, this is kind of like one of the entry levels, one of the main ones for elected office. And they want convictions. And so to guarantee that that happens, just to get another pot, they will charge you with murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, whatever, rape. I'm surprised they didn't charge him with rape. I mean, they could have just, hey, what the hell? They're not going to get in trouble if it later turns out, oh yeah, there was nothing even remotely rapish about it. Even though, I guess, in a case with a hooker and a gun, that would have been something that could easily have been thrown out there. They'll threaten you, they'll coerce you literally. They are literally threatening you with life in prison, rape, and the whole point of that is to get you to squeal so that they can say, look, I have this. And there's actually a ton more. I would highly recommend that book because it actually systematically goes through all the areas. And this is not just theoretical Austrian school, Murray Rothbardism. These are actually by people who Rothbard actually didn't like very much. Just saying, look, here's the data. The data is that statistically, government officials are self-interested. And we can see this in the cops. I mean, the guy who pulled me over. And this is also, well, again, the vast majority of people, though, are not charged with anything that serious. They're just given citations to pay fines. And this is just like the fucking Kings of England. It's a revenue source. And this has also been demonstrated, at least for certain types of traffic violations. I know they've done studies with those red light cameras that have demonstrated that they're actually not safe. They actually cause people to slam on their brakes, to swerve, that sort of thing. They're only there to raise revenue. That's why they exist. And anybody who's been pulled over, the overwhelming majority of encounters with government law enforcement is clearly an attempt to fleece people. And I thought it was ironic, and this is actually typical. The guy who pulled me over was literally under a bridge. He was like a highwayman or a troll just sitting there waiting to pounce on somebody. But I know the departments, because I've known people who've worked for them who said, we get quotas. They're told we need to raise revenue. In my hometown, at one point, this wasn't recently, but years ago, their chief of police in the city said, we need to literally triple the number of dollars that we bring in through traffic violations. Why? Because the city thinks it needs money, which they always do. They always more money. Every problem needs more money. And this is just one of the ways that they do it. And it has clearly nothing to do with law and order, with justice, or with safety for that matter. Those are all pretensive excuses that are actually demonstrably so. Is my slightly tinted top of my window that was so untinted that I at no point in my life ever considered it to even be tinted. When I got the truck in Texas, which I'm going to guess tinted windows are probably legal in Texas because they're probably kind of necessary. They're not necessary, you don't need them in Michigan, but who cares? Well, anyway, there's no danger whatsoever. But it's an excuse to take my money, and that's the point. And that has nothing to do, all these people like the government there is to be an objective third party and you need a single set of rules. It has nothing to do with that. It's just about taking money in that case, at least, and the vast majority of other cases. And so you can talk about your Solomon empire of justice. That's not the one that we have, and there's no system you can make that will make that happen. So that crutch that the state has that you need us is retarded, because they need us to pay them is what they need. And this goes on to judges. Judges will hand down harsher sentences before they run for election. They've done studies here where, because it's not, there's a lot of judges who are appointed and there are a lot of judges who are elected. And the incentives for both are pretty shitty. The ones who are elected will pass down harsher sentences because they're, again, the only thing that they can show the only way they can measure their success is by how many people they throw in prison. They can't say, well, my stat is nobody because there was nobody guilty of anything and I released them all. That would be a good judge. And those people do exist, but they're pretty rare. They get unelected. The appointed ones are political appointees, and so they're far less likely to bite the hand that feeds. They're far less likely to ever rule against the government generally, although the political ones, since they aspire for higher office, if you're elected to a position and you may be hoping that someday you get appointed to the state Supreme Court or maybe to one of the various federal circuit courts, I'm sure a lot of them hope someday they'll be on the Supreme Court. Probably a good idea not to be striking down government laws every chance you get, which if you would really were a constitutionalist, not that I am, but if they were, or if they really cared about justice, they would have to be doing literally all the time. The number of people who are actually murderers and rapists, that segment of what's going through the judicial system, it's probably, if I'm going to be really generous, I'm going to say 15%. And that would mean that they would have to be dabbling and saying nothing. That's very rare. I will say that there is a law. There's thousands and thousands of lawyers. There's a lot of good lawyers. There is a lot of good legal theory out there. And actually, Judge Napolitano is actually pretty close to that. If you watch his lecture at the Mises Institute, he clearly is, I think, a fine jurist. If you look at groups like the Institute for Justice, a lot of those guys are anarcho-capitalists. I looked up a guy named Jacob Hubert who wrote a book called Libertarianism Today. There are, I'm reading this book, which is by a liberal, but there's a lot of people like Glenn Greenwald, and there are a whole bunch of lawyers who really do believe in actual law and order, who do believe in actual civil society and actual justice. But they don't run the government. They don't set the rules in the government, and they would be able to function much better without a state that is continually abrogating itself more power. And of course, in the most basic sense, all I can say is, well, these prosecutors are self-interested, they're trying to make themselves richer, whatever. But also there's a corollary. They probably believe in state power unless they wouldn't be there. And so they're going to have a bias on top of their self-interest against actual justice, against, they don't have a bias for third-party arbitration and fairness. There's probably a few of them who are like that. But they're probably much more likely to have a bias towards authoritarianism, towards the righteousness of government. And it's so clear in evidence where state bureaucrats, especially police, but also lesser bureaucrats, are not prosecuted at all, or completely the opposite of the rest of us, charged with much lower crimes than they've actually committed. This, again, is statistically a fact. It's anecdotally just what we take it for granted that government officials, especially cops, but also, teachers and also, will be charged with much, much less. And that, you cannot look at that and say, oh yeah, that has something to do with, that demonstrates the sagacity and the striving for justice of our legal system. Now that demonstrates either individual bias on the part of those doing it, or a systematic bias throughout the whole system, which is actually demonstrable empirically, not of justice, but of favoritism, but of hypocrisy, but of a double standard, for which we all pay in some. We literally pay for it. Even if you don't get a ticket, even if you don't get arrested, you pay for it with your fucking taxes. And you pay for it in other ways, because we pay for all the people who are in prison. And we lose their contribution to society. And then the really stupid thing about the whole thing is, when the actual crimes happen, usually, like actual murder, it's only about half the murders where someone is actually even charged with a crime. So they don't even that vigorously go after actual criminals. Sometimes they do, if it's political, like if there's a serial killer and it's in the news every day and the government looks inept, which the government's natural kind of state of being is inept. It's ineptitude, it's laziness, it's sloth. Most of us are busy running our lives, and we don't think about it. When there's a case like, say, the DC sniper, or like 9/11 or something, all of a sudden their failure becomes like front page news. 9/11 is a little bit different because it caused like nationalism, but like I think the DC sniper, or say the Unabomber, and then all of a sudden the state has the resources to really go after or try and find the person who's guilty. And the other kind of no-brainer is, most of the really bad things, the government's able to catch somebody like in a day or two, like Oklahoma City. Those are pretty good indicators that the government was involved in a way that didn't let on, which is definitely the case with something like Oklahoma City. It's actually, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but it's also the case with something like 9/11, because the FBI and the CIA had been basically saying this is going to happen at some point. Maybe not this particular thing, but something like this will happen. You can tell the Unabomber is not a government agent because they couldn't find him for 10 years. You can tell the DC sniper was not a government agent because it took them a long time to find that guy. Because they're inept. But yeah, most murders, they never investigate. They don't go, man, justice, we've got to do this. This is what we're here for. No, that means more legwork, and they already got elected, so they don't care. So the whole argument for state justice is pretending that it's something that it's not. It's ignoring the empirical reality that their self-interest is just like everybody else, and they use their position of authority very abusively in a systematic fashion against the rest of us, actually causing injustice, not just not providing justice, but causing injustice, blatant injustice, condoning things, including murder, like when cops kill people and they don't get anything, or they get a slap on the wrist, which is common. It's not routine, but it's common. And also, it's demonstrable that the whole point of it in the first place is just to raise revenue for the state, for the state to absolve itself of crimes, and that there's no theoretical way to make a night watchman state that would act in some kind of idealized, judicious fashion.